Aloha and welcome back. We are going to talk about wealth inequality, I guess mostly in America, but also around the world. We're going to watch this video. It's from 12 years ago. It's got 25 million views, wealth inequality in America. But then I'm also go over some stats that are more current because this is a little bit old. So enjoy.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward.
I find it weird. Sorry for the delay, but I find it weird that people say equal distribution of money wouldn't work. Why wouldn't that work? Then everybody could go buy stuff. You could get your cars, your food, your houses, all that stuff. If some people don't want to work, then all right, y'all go be lazy. But who's just gonna sit there and not do anything? That doesn't make any sense to me.
So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that don't look too bad, but I mean, it doesn't look too much different than the other one. So I mean, I don't. It's not. I don't see what the big deal is.
We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest.
See, to me, this looks pretty bad. I don't. People aren't worth that much more than other people, and this isn't even the reality. But this is what people think, and still, that looks terrible. And people, this is what you think, and this is what you're willing to accept. But then we even accept worse. Like can we start to wake up, start to realize?
20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own.
So this is literally ridiculous. Like, I'm gonna make a video right after this explaining why this is so bad. But I'm pretty sure most people can kind of understand why it's so bad, but I'm gonna let them go on.
Because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them.
So let's see, he just said the top 1% had 40% of the wealth and the bottom 80% had 7% of the wealth. And so I looked up today's, I just looked it up basically, wealth inequality in the United States, with the top 10% households holding the majority of the wealth. In 2022, the top 10% held 67%. And it was 40%. Oh no, that was the top 1%. Okay, so let's see. The bottom 50% holds 2.5% of the nation's wealth, of the nation's wealth. The top 1%, there it is, held 30% of the nation's wealth. Well, I guess they went down 10%, it seems. I don't know. 1963 families, 36 times wealth of middle income class. So the accumulation of wealth enables a variety of freedoms and removes limits on life that one might otherwise face. Federal Reserve data indicates that as of Q4 2021, the top 1% of households in the United States held 30.9% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% held 2.6%. Go back to our video. Let me cut the echo out.
And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker.
And why would the janitor be the lowest paid worker? They're one of the hardest working people. See, that's the thing about capitalism, is the people who sit there and do nothing and just talk get paid the most, and the people that do the hardest work get paid the least.
Needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
So, all right, that is the wealth inequality in America. But then I wanted to look up and see what it was in the world. So, this is wealth inequality through the world. So, it's widening. Top 10% versus the bottom 50%. The top 10% of the world's population owns 76% of the world's wealth, while the bottom 50% own just 2. So it's much worse on a world scale than it is on the United States scale, which is still pretty bad. The top 1% of the world's population owns 38% of the world's wealth, so it's still worse. Corporations are contributing to inequality by opposing labor laws and policies that benefit workers. Only 0.4% of the world's largest corporations are committed to paying workers a living wage. Only 0.4%, it says, are committed to paying workers a living wage. Let's see, down here. 2018, the 26 richest people in the world held as much wealth as half of the global population. That's 3.8 billion people, down from 43 the year before. This matters because rapid rise in income at the top are driving and exacerbating within country income inequality. So I'm pretty good with charts, and here's the charts that we were looking at earlier, these two really. And this chart I was looking at, and it was kind of confusing me. I'm good with charts, and I was like, what is the people and the stuff? But so 68% or 68.7% of people in the world have 3% of the world's wealth. The next 29 or 22.9% of people in the world have 13.7% of the world's wealth. This little guy, because I was like, what are these little dots? Like, why is it like that? But now, so the next 7.7% own 42% of the world's wealth. But then the top 0.7% own almost half of the world's wealth, 41%. So that's a problem. And that's capitalism spread throughout the world through imperialism. And we need to do something. And again, the Green Party is a world party. There's green parties in every country just about. And if we could do something in America to make the Green Party more viable, we can get world change much faster than trying to incrementally do it through the Democratic Party. And so my next video will be on the power of the rich, piggybacking off of this one. And until then, aloha.